On October 9, 1934, a film camera in Marseille, France, captured something that had never been captured on film before: a king being assassinated in real time, close enough that the cameraman's own shadow falls across the body. The footage is still watched today, nearly a century later. What almost nobody who watches it knows is what happened next, 400 miles away, to an 11-year-old boy who was about to become a king himself because of it. A king who would rule for exactly 11 days before losing his country to one dictator and the rest of his life to another. He would end up selling loans at a savings and loan office in Los Angeles. He is, to this day, the only European monarch ever buried on American soil. The gunman was a Bulgarian marksman named Vlado Chernozemski, a trained assassin already wanted for 2 prior political killings, acting on behalf of a Macedonian revolutionary organization that wanted independence from Yugoslav rule. He hadn't acted alone, and he hadn't acted spontaneously. According to multiple historical accounts, the plot had been assembled months earlier with the direct involvement of Croatian separatists known as the Ustasha, and quietly backed at the highest level by Benito Mussolini's fascist Italy, which had its own long-standing designs on carving up the Balkans. Chernozemski fired more than 10 rounds before a French cavalry officer cut him down in the street. 15 people were hit in total, King Alexander among them. The French foreign minister riding beside him, Louis Barthou, was also wounded in the arm and died hours later, reportedly from inadequate emergency treatment rather than the wound itself. It was, in other words, not a lone act of madness, but a coordinated act of state-adjacent terrorism carried out on foreign soil against a king whose own country was already one of the most combustible political fault lines left over from the First World War. The same region, the same tangle of nationalisms that had put a bullet into an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo barely 20 years earlier and dragged the entire world into war behind it. Yugoslavia, in other words, had already proven once that a single assassination on its territory could reshape the map of Europe. Nobody watching the newsreel in 1934 could have known they were watching the opening act of the same story happening again. The man in the film was King Alexander I of Yugoslavia, arriving in Marseille aboard a naval destroyer for a state visit intended to shore up an alliance with France. He rode through the streets in an open car beside the French foreign minister, waving to a curious crowd lining a boulevard the locals called the Champs-Élysées of Marseille. Minutes later, a gunman stepped off the running board of the car itself and opened fire at point-blank range. Alexander was superstitious and had reportedly avoided public appearances on Tuesdays for years after 3 family deaths had all fallen on that day of the week. October 9, 1934, was a Tuesday. He died in the back seat of the car, eyes open, before it ever reached the hospital. The cameras kept rolling. It became, within days, one of the most watched pieces of film on Earth, and it left the throne of Yugoslavia to a boy who wasn't even supposed to inherit it in the first place. Alexander himself had only become heir because his own older brother, George, had been quietly forced to renounce his claim years earlier after an incident in which a servant died following an altercation with him, the kind of scandal a royal house simply buried rather than let become public record. That was, in its way, the pattern of this entire dynasty, going back further than anyone in Marseille that day probably cared to remember. Alexander's own father, Peter I, had come to the Serbian throne in 1903 only after a group of army officers stormed the royal palace in Belgrade in the dead of night, hunted down the reigning king and his wife inside their own bedroom, shot them both, and threw both bodies out of a window into the palace garden below, where they lay for hours before anyone dared move them. The officers who carried out that coup didn't do it for Peter I personally. He was living quietly in exile in Geneva at the time and had no part in planning it. But once the killing was done, he was the branch of the family the plotters decided to install, and he accepted the crown that violence had cleared for him. Violence had put this family in power once already, decades before Alexander was ever born. It would come looking for his son, and eventually his grandson again. Peter, the boy who would eventually inherit the name, the crown, and in time, the same restless bad luck, was 11 years old when his father's assassination made him king in name only. He was too young to rule, so a regency was established under his cousin, Prince Paul, a cultured, art-collecting, deeply cautious man who spent the better part of the next 7 years trying to keep a small, ethnically and religiously fractured Balkan kingdom out of the way of a continent sliding toward war. Yugoslavia itself was barely older than Peter, stitched together only in 1918 at the end of the First World War, out of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, who had spent centuries under different empires, different religions, different alphabets, and had never fully agreed on what the new country they now shared was actually supposed to be. Holding that fragile arrangement together, while Hitler's Germany grew stronger on one border and Mussolini's Italy eyed the Adriatic coastline on another, would have tested a far more experienced statesman than a regent who hadn't even wanted the job in the first place. Peter, meanwhile, was sent to be educated the way princes of that era were educated. English schools, eventually Cambridge, groomed for a throne that events would barely let him sit on, while Prince Paul spent the second half of the 1930s making one uncomfortable concession after another, trying to buy his country time it never actually got. By March of 1941, the war Prince Paul had spent years trying to avoid arrived at Yugoslavia's door anyway. Under enormous pressure from Berlin, and with German troops massing on the country's borders, Paul's Regency government signed the Tripartite Pact, formally aligning Yugoslavia with Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. The reaction on the streets of Belgrade was immediate and furious. Crowds gathered, chanting a phrase that would outlive nearly everything else about that spring: "Better the grave than a slave. Better war than the pact." 2 nights later, a group of pro-Western military officers led by a general named Dusan Simovic moved. In the early hours of March 27, 1941, troops loyal to the plotters seized key installations across Belgrade: the radio station, government buildings, the telephone exchange, while units surrounded the homes of the Regency government's leading ministers. Prince Paul himself was located and effectively placed under arrest before the sun came up. Somewhere else in the city, in his own bed, 17-year-old Peter was woken in the middle of the night by men who had just overthrown his own government on his behalf and told, in essence, that he was now expected to rule immediately, whether he was prepared to or not. He was driven out into streets already filling with crowds who had heard the news and come out anyway, in the dark, to celebrate a coup they hadn't known was coming an hour earlier. By the time Belgrade's radio station broadcast the news that morning, Peter had been formally proclaimed king in his own right, by decree, technically 2 years ahead of the moment he was supposed to legally come of age. For the first time in his life, Peter II of Yugoslavia was genuinely, fully king. He had the job for 11 days. Adolf Hitler took the coup as a personal insult and a strategic threat, and responded with characteristic overwhelming force. On April 6, 1941, Palm Sunday that year, and a date Belgrade would remember for decades afterward, German bombers struck the city without any declaration of war, flying wave after wave over an undefended capital and killing an estimated several thousand people in a single morning, many of them still in their beds or on their way to church. ground forces poured across the borders from 4 directions simultaneously, from Austria in the north, from Bulgaria in the east, from occupied Albania and Italy in the south and west, coordinated with a speed the Yugoslav military, still partially mobilizing, had no realistic chance of matching. The army itself was already fracturing along the same ethnic lines that had made the country so difficult to hold together in the first place, with entire Croatian units refusing to fight for a Serb-dominated government many of them had never fully accepted. Within a week, organized resistance had effectively collapsed. On April 17th, 11 days after the invasion began and not even a full month after he'd been declared king, the government formally capitulated. Peter, along with what remained of his cabinet, was already gone by then, flown out ahead of the collapse to Greece, then Jerusalem, then Cairo, chasing an increasingly thin hope of coordinating resistance from outside a country that no longer had a functioning government left to resist with. He arrived in London in June of 1941 to lead a government in exile, one more crowned head among several washed up in wartime Britain, with a title and very little else. He finished his interrupted education at Cambridge in between diplomatic duties and formally joined the Royal Air Force, at least nominally, the way a number of displaced European royals took on symbolic wartime service during those years. For a while, his government mattered. Yugoslav resistance fighters loyal to the crown, led by a colonel named Draža Mihailović, operating under the name Chetniks, were for a time the only organized force inside occupied Yugoslavia the Allies had any real contact with, and Peter seized on that fact as proof his exiled government still had a genuine stake in the war's outcome. He held on to the hope for years that Mihailovic's forces would eventually pave the way for his own return to Belgrade as a liberating king. It didn't last. Inside occupied Yugoslavia itself, a second resistance movement had emerged alongside Mihailovic's royalist Chetniks, communist partisans led by a man named Josip Broz, better known by his wartime alias, Tito. The two movements were nominally fighting the same German occupiers, but they increasingly spent as much energy fighting each other as they did the Axis, each one positioning itself for the political vacuum that would open up once the Germans were eventually driven out. As the war ground on, Allied intelligence assessments increasingly concluded that Tito's partisans were inflicting far more actual damage on German forces than Mihailovic's Chetniks, some of whose local commanders had, in certain regions, drifted into uneasy accommodations with the occupying forces rather than direct confrontation. By 1944, Winston Churchill himself had shifted the weight of British support decisively away from the king's own royalist fighters and toward the communists who would, within a year, end the monarchy altogether. Peter had spent 3 years in exile trying to hold on to a throne through the men fighting on his behalf inside his own country. The Allies deciding his country's future had already started planning around the assumption that those men, and the king who backed them, wouldn't be the ones running Yugoslavia once the guns fell silent. In the middle of all of it, in March of 1944, with the war still raging and his own government in exile increasingly irrelevant to the war's actual outcome, Peter did something his own ministers and even Churchill himself thought was close to reckless. He got married. His bride was Princess Alexandra of Greece and Denmark, and their meeting in wartime London was less a chance encounter between strangers than the collision of two people who had already lived nearly identical lives without ever having met. Alexandra's own family had been deposed and exiled from Greece back in 1924, when she was barely a year old. She had spent her childhood shuttled between relatives in Italy and boarding schools in Britain, separated from her own mother for long stretches, forced to move again when the Axis invasion of Greece scattered what remained of her family a second time in 1941. By the time she and Peter actually met in London, Both of them had already spent their entire adult lives and most of their childhoods being made homeless by the same century's violence. The wedding, when it finally happened on March 20, 1944, was staged at the Yugoslav embassy in London with a guest list that read like a registry of Europe's dispossessed royalty: King George VI of Britain, King George II of Greece, King Haakon VII of Norway, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, reigning monarchs and exiled ones standing in the same room, several of them guests in someone else's country themselves, watching two more of their own get married with no throne of their own left standing to invite anyone back to. A year later, when Alexandra was expecting their only child, the British government arranged one final piece of theater on the couple's behalf, so that the boy, Crown Prince Alexander, heir to a throne that was, by then, only months from ceasing to exist, could technically be born on Yugoslav soil. Winston Churchill personally declared a single hotel suite, room 212 at Claridge's in London, to be Yugoslav territory for the day. It is, quite possibly, the smallest country ever to exist, and it existed for less than 24 hours inside a London hotel for the sole purpose of legitimizing a birth that would ultimately inherit nothing at all. 7 months after that birth, in November of 1945, Tito's new communist government held a referendum, formally abolished the Yugoslav monarchy, and declared the country a republic. Peter was stripped of his throne. He was banned permanently from ever setting foot in Yugoslavia again. He would never see the country he had technically ruled for 11 days, 3 years earlier, for the rest of his life. What followed was not exile in any of the dignified senses that word usually implies. Peter settled first in London, then increasingly in the United States, where a title carried social cachet, but no actual income, no estate, no institutional support beyond whatever Serbian and Yugoslav émigré communities could scrape together and send him week to week so that a king could keep something resembling a household. He tried public relations work in New York. He wrote a memoir, A King's Heritage, in 1955, which sold modestly and briefly. By the middle of that same decade, by several accounts, he was writing checks in Paris that bounced and selling off pieces of his family's remaining jewelry simply to keep current bills paid. A deposed monarch quietly pawning the last physical evidence that any of it had ever been real. The Serbian royalist faithful, the same émigré network that had been sending him weekly contributions for years, kept alive their own version of hope regardless. In the mid-1960s, members of a resistance-linked veterans organization promised him that a castle would be built for him in New York, with his name and title carved above the door: Peter II, King of Yugoslavia. It never materialized. It joined a long list of things promised to a king who had nothing left to actually rule, made by people who needed, almost as much as he did, to believe that the crown still meant something concrete somewhere in the world. Instead, America mostly treated him as a novelty. He appeared on television programs. He toured a steel mill. He gave a talk to a women's club in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. A deposed European monarch, educated at Cambridge, once declared a sovereign hotel room in London for his own son's birth, standing in front of a civic group in a small Midwestern city, making conversation about a country that no longer let him set foot inside it. Underneath the novelty appearances and the after-dinner speeches, multiple accounts describe worsening depression and, increasingly, alcoholism as the years wore on, the grinding, specific erosion of a man whose entire identity had been built around a role that existed nowhere anymore except on the cover of his own memoir. The marriage buckled under the same pressure. Peter and Alexandra separated more than once during these years. By some accounts, he strayed, at one point growing close to a Serbian-American woman named Milica Anđelković, known to friends as Michi Lou, after he began staying with her and her husband during his early visits to the United States in the mid-1950s. During one of the couple's estrangements, Alexandra took an overdose of sleeping pills and slipped into a coma, recovering only after several days. It emerged afterward that during that same difficult stretch, she had also tried, separately, to harm herself. It was, by any reading, one of the darkest points in a marriage that had started in a room full of exiled kings promising each other that something of their world would survive. And yet, as difficult as it clearly was, it was not the end of it. The two of them found their way back to each other again and again through the late 1950s and 1960s, reconciling more than once, at one point living together quietly in a small 4-room apartment in Cannes on the French Riviera, supported, as they had been for years by then, by whatever Serbian exiles abroad could still spare to send them, so that a king and a queen with no kingdom left could keep something that still resembled a home. By the mid-1960s, Peter, the deposed king of a country that no longer permitted him to return, with essentially no fortune left to speak of, finally took an ordinary job. In 1967, he went to work at the Sterling Savings and Loan Association in Los Angeles. It's worth sitting with that fact for a moment, because it tells you almost everything about the distance this man traveled over 3 decades. A boy who became king because a film camera captured his father's murder in real time, who was formally crowned amid cheering crowds at 17, who fled 4 countries in 11 days, who once had an entire hotel suite declared sovereign territory for his son's sake, ended his working life processing paperwork behind a desk in a strip mall savings and loan, one deposed monarch among the millions of ordinary Angelenos who never knew exactly who was helping them with their accounts. He died on November 3, 1970, of cirrhosis of the liver following a failed transplant in a hospital in Denver after having lived his final years largely in Los Angeles. He was 47 years old. Because Tito's government still refused to allow his body to be returned to Yugoslavia even in death, Peter was buried at a Serbian Orthodox monastery in the small town of Libertyville, Illinois, a modest, unlikely resting place for a king, chosen not because it meant anything to him personally, but because it was, quite simply, the nearest sizable Serbian community willing and able to take him in. He remains to this day the only European monarch ever buried on American soil. He lay there for 43 years in a country he had once fled to and eventually worked in, while the country he was actually born to rule refused, for 4 decades, to take him back even as a corpse. The son born in that single sovereign hotel room at Claridge's grew up to live out a strange, quieter echo of his father's exact same story. Crown Prince Alexander, baptized at Westminster Abbey with King George VI and the future Queen Elizabeth II standing as his godparents, a boy once genuinely in line for the British throne himself before he forfeited that claim by marrying a Roman Catholic, spent most of his own adult life the same way his father had, paying his own bills, taking out an ordinary mortgage, serving a stint in the British Army, inheriting a title that opened doors and paid for nothing. It wasn't until 2000, following the fall of Slobodan Milosevic's government, that Serbia finally allowed the family to come home. Alexander and his relatives were granted back the citizenship that had been stripped from them in 1947, and were given use of the same royal compound in Belgrade his family had been driven out of 55 years earlier, a compound where, for much of the intervening decades, Tito himself had actually lived, ruling communist Yugoslavia from inside the White Palace until his own death in 1980. When Alexander finally moved back in, he found the marks the communist era had left behind, a star etched into a granite column, a religious fresco deliberately defaced, a bullet hole punched clean through the painted image of Christ on the chapel ceiling. And he chose, deliberately, to leave every one of them exactly as he found them rather than restore the palace to how it had looked before his family was thrown out of it. Only dictators, he told a reporter years later, try to alter history. You can never actually erase the past. It took Crown Prince Alexander until 2013 to win his father the right to come home too, if only as a set of remains in a coffin, 43 years after his death and 68 years after Tito's referendum first erased him. Yugoslavia, the country Peter had briefly and disastrously ruled, no longer even existed by the time anyone got around to correcting the injustice of his burial. It had violently fractured into half a dozen separate nations during the wars of the 1990s. But Serbia, the republic at the historical heart of what Peter's family had once ruled, eventually decided the old king deserved better than a borrowed grave in Illinois. In May of 2013, Peter's remains were exhumed, flown across the Atlantic, and reburied at the Royal Mausoleum at Oplenac, alongside the very same Karađorđević ancestors whose violent, coup-installed history had put his own family on the throne in the first place. Serbia's president, at the reburial ceremony, said the country could no longer afford the divisions and injustices of the past. It had taken 68 years since his deposition and 43 years since his death for anyone with the actual authority to say so. What makes Peter II's story different from almost every other deposed monarch of the 20th century isn't the losing. Plenty of kings lost their thrones to the two great totalitarian movements of that era. It's the almost total absence of any single villain to blame it on. He wasn't destroyed by one family member's grudge, or one novelist's betrayal, or one jealous rival's whisper campaign. He was erased, methodically and impersonally, by the two largest political forces of the 20th century operating in sequence. First, Hitler's invasion took his country by force in 11 days, and then Tito's revolution took it by ballot and by decree, permanently 4 years later, and neither of them needed to know or care anything about who Peter actually was as a person in order to finish the job completely. A film camera made him king at 11. A coup made him a real king, briefly, at 17. A referendum he had no vote in unmade him for good at 22. Everything after that, the drinking, the poverty, the savings and loan counter in Los Angeles, was just a 47-year-old man quietly living out the consequences of decisions that had all been made by other people before he'd even finished growing up.